The air inside the throne chamber of Nyrixia felt charged, almost alive. Streams of bioluminescent energy danced along the crystalline walls, pulsing to the rhythm of the monarch's heartbeat. King Thalvin, draped in ceremonial armor that shimmered like molten starlight, stood atop the dais with a deep frown etched into his chiseled face. Before him knelt his only daughter, Princess Sorella, a figure so unassuming that she seemed out of place in the grandiosity of the empire. The king's voice boomed, heavy with disappointment. "Sorella, you carry the blood of conquerors, yet you cannot hold a blade steady, nor outwit the most basic of combat drones. By the stars, how can you expect to lead?" Sorella flinched but remained silent. Her violet eyes, a hallmark of the royal bloodline, shimmered with defiance, even as her posture betrayed uncertainty. She was painfully aware of the court's murmurs behind her, whispers of disapproval and pity that coiled around her like vipers. Thalvin paced, his steps sending ripples through the floating holographic displays of warships and battle formations. His gaze turned to a shimmering portal suspended in the air, a live feed of the Empire's outer territories, where enemy fleets gathered like storm clouds. "We are on the brink of war," the king declared, his voice a weapon in itself, "and my only heir is unprepared." The silence that followed was suffocating until Sorella's quiet voice broke it. "Perhaps I am not meant to lead in war, father. Perhaps my path lies elsewhere." Thalvin's eyes narrowed. He had heard this argument before, and each time it stung like an old wound reopened. "The galaxy respects strength, Sorella, not elsewhere." He exhaled deeply, his frustration turning into resolve. "But perhaps strength can be acquired." The court gasped as Thalvin's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The king raised his hand, and the throne room's energy fields shimmered, revealing a transmission orb. With a flick of his wrist, the orb activated, and an image of a rugged human appeared. A man sitting casually in a chair that looked like it had been cobbled together from salvaged starship parts. "Dax Calhoun," Thalvin announced, his tone heavy with disdain. "A mercenary from Earth. Retired, if such a creature can even grasp the concept." The human, unaware of the court's judgment, scratched his scruffy jaw and tilted his head. "This thing on? Hello? Your Majesty or Highness or whatever? You got the wrong guy if this is about overdue parking tickets." Sorella bit back a laugh. It was the first spark of humor she'd felt all day, and it burned through the tension like a ray of sunlight piercing a storm. Thalvin's expression remained stony. "You will take my daughter to Earth," he commanded, ignoring Dax's flippant demeanor. "Train her. Make her a warrior worthy of the Nyrixian throne. If you fail—" The king's tone darkened, a subtle threat weaving itself into the air. Dax raised an eyebrow, leaning closer to the camera. "Let me get this straight. You want me, a humble farmer?" He gestured vaguely at the cluttered backdrop of his video feed, which included a half-disassembled plasma rifle and what appeared to be a chicken perched on a fusion coil, "to turn her into a warrior, and you're paying me how much for this madness?" "The reward is irrelevant," Thalvin snapped, though the court knew the king had sweetened the deal with a sum that could buy entire planets. "Do you accept or not?" Dax sighed theatrically, rubbing his temples. "Fine. But don't blame me when she ends up liking Earth food more than your fancy glowing algae soup or whatever it is you people eat." Sorella's protest was lost as the hologram blinked out. The king turned to his daughter, his expression unreadable. "You leave tomorrow. Perhaps the harshness of Earth will forge you into something greater, or perhaps it will break you. Either way, the Empire cannot wait for you to find yourself here." The journey to Earth was unceremonious. Sorella found herself crammed into a cargo ship that smelled of burned circuits and something disturbingly organic. Her royal entourage had been left behind, replaced by a surly Nyrixian pilot who didn't bother hiding his disdain. When the ship finally landed, Sorella stepped onto Earth soil, or rather the rust-colored dirt of a place Dax called the middle of nowhere. Before her stood the man himself, wearing an oil-stained shirt, cargo pants, and a smirk that screamed unimpressed. Well, if it isn't Princess Glowstick," Dax drawled, eyeing her shimmering gown and perfectly styled hair. "Hope you brought some sneakers, Your Majesty. Those heels aren't going to last long out here." Sorella straightened her posture, determined not to let this human rattle her. "I was told you are a warrior of great renown. What I see before me is questionable." Dax grinned, motioning for her to follow him. "Don't worry, kid. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be kicking butt and taking names. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn to appreciate a good earth taco." "Taco?" Sorella asked, her regal tone faltering in confusion. "You'll see," Dax replied, chuckling to himself. As they entered his ramshackle farm, a sprawling mix of earth tech, alien relics, and livestock with questionable origins, Sorella's initial horror began to morph into reluctant curiosity. This was a world unlike anything she had known, and while it was messy, chaotic, and completely undignified, it held a strange kind of charm. And so began the first steps of Sorella's transformation, not through battles or glory, but through the slow, gritty process of adapting to a world that made no concessions for royalty. By the time the sun set, Sorella sat on a wooden crate, utterly exhausted after hauling buckets of water and chopping wood. Dax plopped down beside her, handing her a bottle of something called soda. "To surviving your first day," he said, raising his own bottle in a mock toast. Sorella hesitated, then clinked her bottle against his. "To survival," she echoed, taking a sip and promptly spitting it out. Dax laughed, a sound that was more genuine than Sorella had expected. Lesson 1. Earth drinks aren't fancy, but they'll grow on you, like everything else here. For the first time since leaving Nyrixia, Sorella smiled. Morning came to the farm with a cacophony of sounds that Sorella could only describe as offensive. Somewhere near the makeshift barn, a creature that Dax called a rooster was screeching its lungs out, while something mechanical in the distance clanked rhythmically. Sorella groaned and rolled over on the lumpy cot Dax had so generously provided in the corner of his workshop. She had slept in starlit chambers back home, with gravity-moderating fields and dream-enhancing bioluminescence. Here, she slept next to a grease-stained workbench and a half-disassembled spacecraft engine. Dax strolled in, sipping from a chipped mug and grinning like someone who enjoyed watching others suffer. "Rise and shine, princess. Time to earn your keep." "I fail to see how manual labor will make me a warrior," Sorella muttered, rubbing her eyes. "Trust me, it builds character," Dax said, setting the mug down. "And muscle. Besides, nothing says warrior training like hauling fertilizer." Sorella blinked at him, horrified. "Fertilizer?" Dax chuckled, clearly relishing her discomfort. "Relax. You'll survive. Probably." The day's training began with Dax handing Sorella an ancient-looking wheelbarrow that wobbled like it was held together by sheer willpower. She was instructed to fill it with dirt and transport it to a plot of land Dax had grandly referred to as the field. In reality, it was a patch of earth so stubbornly infertile that even weeds looked hesitant to grow there. As Sorella struggled with the unwieldy contraption, Dax leaned against a fence, arms crossed, and offered helpful commentary. "You know, back on Nyrixia, they probably have some fancy anti-grav device for this," he mused. "We do," Sorella grunted, straining to push the wheelbarrow. "Well, consider this retro training," he said, smirking. "What happens if you're stranded somewhere without your tech? You'll thank me when you've got the strongest arms in the galaxy." Sorella shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "I would rather be stranded than endure this nonsense." "Atta girl," Dax said, tipping his imaginary hat. By midday, Sorella's royal patience was wearing thin. She slumped against a tree, fanning herself with a makeshift leaf. Sweat glistened on her glowing blue skin, a feature Dax had nicknamed her nightlight mode. "This is absurd," she said, exasperated. "I am the heir to an empire, and you have me digging trenches." Dax sat nearby, chewing on something he called jerky, which Sorella suspected was made from questionable creatures. "Welcome to Earth," he said. "Our warriors start from the ground up. Literally. Besides, you've got potential, kid. I saw you lift that log yesterday like it was nothing." "That was not a log. It was a twig," Sorella replied. "Details," Dax said, waving her off. It's all about mindset. Sorella rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the tiny flicker of pride. She had managed to lift something heavier than she thought possible, though she wasn't about to admit it out loud. As the days turned into weeks, Sorella began to adapt. Slowly. Dax's training methods were unconventional to say the least. One day he had her running laps around the field while dodging what he called Earth's most dangerous predator, a creature named Fluffy, who turned out to be a particularly aggressive goat. Another day, he introduced her to Earth cuisine, which included something called a corn dog. It's a stick of meat covered in bread, Dax explained, as Sorella stared at the bizarre food item. Why is it on a stick? She asked, suspicious. Because humans are efficient, Dax said, taking a bite. You'll get used to it, and if you don't, it makes a decent weapon. To her surprise, Sorella found herself laughing more often than not. Dax's sarcastic humor and easygoing nature were a stark contrast to the stiff formalities of the Nyrixian court. He teased her mercilessly, but there was an odd sort of camaraderie in their interactions. Sorella's training wasn't all dirt and jokes. As her body grew stronger, so did her connection to the latent abilities she had inherited from her alien lineage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood in the field practicing with a makeshift staff. Dax watched from a distance, his ever-present smirk replaced by something more thoughtful. "You've got good instincts," he said finally, approaching her. Sorella paused, panting. "I have been practicing." "No, it's more than that," Dax said, tapping the staff with his finger. "There's something extra about you. Like you've got this energy, just waiting to be tapped into. Kind of like my old starship engines. Temperamental, but powerful when they work." Sorella raised an eyebrow. "You are comparing me to a malfunctioning machine?" Dax grinned. "You catch on quick." Despite the humor, his words lingered in her mind. That night, as she lay on the cot in the workshop, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the energy Dax had mentioned. She could feel it too, a faint hum beneath her skin, like static electricity waiting to spark. The chapter closed with a moment of quiet introspection. As Sorella stood outside, gazing at the stars, she realized she no longer felt like an outsider on Earth. The dirt, the sweat, the strange food, all of it was becoming familiar. Dax appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming mugs of something he called cocoa. He handed her one without a word, and they stood together, staring at the same sky from 2 very different worlds. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked after a long silence. "Your old life as a warrior?" Dax shrugged. "Sometimes. But then I think about how peaceful it is here. No battles, no empires to save. Just me, Fluffy, and the occasional alien princess ruining my farm equipment." Sorella laughed softly. "Perhaps you are right. Peace does have its charm." Dax glanced at her and smirked. "Don't get too comfortable, Glowstick. Tomorrow, we're building fences." As they clinked mugs in an unspoken truce, Sorella couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this strange planet and this strange man than she had ever imagined. The workshop was unusually quiet that morning. No clanging tools, no Dax humming off-key Earth songs, and most importantly, no aggressive goat ambushes. Sorella stood at the edge of the farm's battered training yard, her staff in hand, staring down a target dummy made from old tires and duct tape. Its face was a crudely drawn smiley face that somehow felt mocking. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, twirling the staff with a modicum of grace. Dax, reclining in a lawn chair nearby with his feet propped up on an overturned crate, waved dismissively. "Ridiculous is underestimating a smiley-faced opponent. Trust me, princess, if you can beat Tire Tony, you can beat anything." Sorella shot him an incredulous look. "You named the dummy?" "Of course I named him," Dax said, taking a sip from his ever-present mug of coffee. "Respect your enemies, no matter how rubbery they are." Rolling her eyes, Sorella took a deep breath and swung the staff. It connected with the makeshift dummy, sending it teetering backward but not toppling over. Dax let out a low whistle. Not bad. 10% less flailing than yesterday. I do not flail, Sorella snapped, planting the staff into the ground with a scowl. Keep telling yourself that, Dax said, grinning. Anyway, we're moving on to Phase 2. Before she could ask what Phase 2 entailed, Dax stood and pressed a button on a remote. The dummy's head lit up with a bright blue glow, and suddenly it wasn't just a pile of tires anymore. Holographic projections sprang to life, creating the illusion of an armored opponent wielding a glowing energy blade. Sorella blinked in surprise. That is impressive. Dax shrugged. Yeah, well, even farmers need hobbies. Meet Combat Dummy 3000, patent pending. You break it, you buy it. The hologram lunged toward her, blade humming with an eerie resonance. Sorella barely had time to dodge, stumbling back with a yelp. Focus, Dax called out, leaning against the fence to watch. Tony's not going easy on you today. As the training progressed, Sorella found herself sweating, not the dignified, glistening kind of perspiration she was used to, but the messy, dirt-streaked reality of hard work. The holographic dummy was relentless, its movements swift and unpredictable. It felt more like a dance than a fight, and for once, Sorella wasn't entirely terrible at it. She spun her staff in a wide arc, deflecting the dummy's blade before countering with a strike to its side. The hologram flickered briefly, and Dax gave an approving nod. There you go. Now do that about 50 more times and you'll almost be average. Sorella glared at him but couldn't suppress a small, triumphant smile. Perhaps Tire Tony should fear me after all. By midday, Sorella collapsed onto the grass, breathing heavily. Dax tossed her a bottle of water, which she caught with surprising agility. You're improving, he said, sitting beside her. Even if you still move like you're in a ballroom instead of a battlefield. Perhaps that is because I was trained for diplomacy, not combat, Sorella replied, taking a long sip of water. Well, you're not in a palace anymore, Dax said, his tone softer than usual. Out here you've got to adapt, and you're doing better than I expected. She glanced at him, surprised by the rare compliment. Thank you, I think. Dax grinned. Don't let it go to your head. You still couldn't take Fluffy in a fair fight. Sorella groaned, leaning back against the tree behind her. Must you ruin every moment of sincerity with humor? It's a gift, Dax said, tipping his imaginary hat. On that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dax led Sorella to a hidden corner of the farm, a secluded clearing surrounded by tall trees that seemed to hum with latent energy. In the center stood a strange contraption, a mix of Earth and alien technology. What is this? Sorella asked, eyeing the device warily. Call it a hunch, Dax said, crouching beside the machine to activate it. I've been tinkering with this for years. It's a kind of energy amplifier, something to boost latent abilities. And you, Princess, are just the test subject I need. Sorella raised an eyebrow. You wish to use me as an experiment? Relax. Worst case scenario, you glow a little brighter for a few days, Dax said with a smirk. Best case scenario, we figure out what that spark inside you really is. Curiosity won out over caution, and Sorella stepped closer. The machine whirred to life, emitting a soft hum that resonated in her chest. She placed her hands on the glowing panels as instructed, feeling a surge of warmth spread through her body. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the air around her began to shimmer. Her skin glowed brighter, the violet hue of her eyes intensifying. The energy that had always hummed beneath the surface now felt like a roaring current, and for a moment, Sorella was afraid she might lose control. Breathe, Dax said, his voice calm and steady. Focus on it. Don't fight it. Guide it. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The energy responded, bending to her will. When she opened her eyes again, she saw tendrils of light swirling around her hands like living things. Whoa, Dax said, clearly impressed. That's new. Sorella stared at her hands, a mix of awe and fear in her expression. What does this mean? It means you're not just any alien princess. Dax said, grinning. "You're a walking, talking, glowing power source, and if we figure out how to harness that, you might just be unstoppable." As they walked back to the farm, Sorella couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had potential, not just as a royal figurehead, but as something more. Dax clapped her on the back as they reached the workshop. "Get some rest, Glowstick. Tomorrow we're cranking things up a notch." Sorella rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. "Is there ever a day when you do not crank things up a notch?" "It's not on this farm," Dax said with a wink. As she lay on her cot that night, the hum of the energy still lingering in her veins, Sorella couldn't help but wonder what the future held. For the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an adventure. The morning began with chaos, as usual. Fluffy the goat had somehow managed to climb onto the roof of the workshop, and Dax stood below, hollering commands that the goat clearly ignored. "How does she even get up there?" Sorella asked, staring in disbelief. "Dark magic," Dax muttered, shaking his head. "Either that, or she's part mountain goat. Grab the broom. She hates the broom." As Sorella joined the comical effort to dislodge the stubborn creature, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of normalcy. The farm, as chaotic and ridiculous as it was, had become her new home. But that sense of normalcy was shattered when the sky above them split open with a thunderous boom. A sleek silver starship descended from the clouds, its reflective hull glinting in the sunlight. It hovered above the farm for a moment before landing with surprising grace in the middle of the training yard, kicking up a cloud of dust that sent Fluffy scrambling off the roof in a flurry of indignant bleats. Dax straightened, brushing dirt off his shirt. "Well, that's not ominous at all." The ship's ramp lowered with a hiss, and out stepped a figure who could only be described as regal. Tall and imposing, with a crown-like crest of bioluminescent spines atop his head, King Tyvarex of Nyrixia surveyed the farm with an expression that was equal parts disdain and curiosity. His entourage of armored guards flanked him, their weapons gleaming ominously. "Father?" Sorella's voice was a mix of shock and confusion as she stepped forward. "Daughter," the king replied, his tone cold but tinged with something unreadable. His glowing eyes swept over her, lingering on the dirt-streaked tunic and the staff she held like a lifeline. "You look different." Sorella stiffened. "And you are trespassing." Dax stifled a laugh, but quickly turned it into a cough when Tyvarex's gaze shifted to him. "Ah, you must be the babysitter," the king said, his lip curling ever so slightly. "Babysitter?" Dax repeated, feigning offense. "I'll have you know I'm a fully certified alien trainer. Thank you very much." "Certified by whom?" Tyvarex asked, unimpressed. Dax gestured vaguely toward the barn. "The Galactic Association of Not Your Business." Sorella pinched the bridge of her nose, already regretting her decision to introduce the two men. After an awkward pause, the group relocated to the farmhouse, where Dax insisted on serving tea. King Tyvarex stared at the chipped mugs with an expression that suggested he'd rather drink engine oil. "To what do we owe the honor, Your Majesty?" Dax asked, settling into his chair with an air of casual defiance. "I came to see my daughter's progress," Tyvarex said, his gaze flicking to Sorella. "It has been nearly a year since I entrusted her to your care. I wish to assess the results for myself." Sorella's heart sank. This wasn't a visit, it was an inspection. "Well, you're in for a treat," Dax said, leaning back and propping his feet on the table. "She's a natural. Just yesterday, she took down Combat Dummy 3000 without breaking a sweat." Tyvarex raised an eyebrow. "Combat Dummy 3000? Long story," Sorella said quickly. The king leaned forward, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Show me." The training yard was eerily quiet as Sorella stepped forward, the staff in her hands feeling heavier than usual. Tyvarex stood at the edge of the field, his arms crossed, while Dax fiddled with the settings on Combat Dummy 3000. "Give it your best shot, princess," Dax said, flashing her a reassuring grin. Sorella took a deep breath and nodded. As the holographic dummy sprang to life, she let her instincts take over. Her movements were fluid and precise, each strike of the staff guided by the strange energy that had awakened within her. She dodged the dummy's blade with ease, countering with a powerful sweep that sent it staggering. When the hologram lunged again, she spun around and delivered a final blow to its core, causing it to flicker and deactivate. The yard was silent for a moment before Dax let out a low whistle. That, my friend, is what we call progress. Tyvorex's expression was unreadable as he approached. Impressive, he said finally, though his tone lacked warmth. But strength alone is not enough. There is a storm brewing in the galaxy, and I fear you are unprepared for what lies ahead. Later that evening, the farmhouse was quiet. Tyvorex had retreated to his ship, leaving Sorella and Dax alone in the kitchen. Storm brewing, huh? Dax said, breaking the silence. Sounds dramatic. Sorella stared into her mug of cocoa, her thoughts swirling. He's not wrong. My father wouldn't have come all this way if the situation weren't dire. Any idea what he's talking about? Sorella shook her head. Number. But if it's serious enough to involve me, it must be connected to the Empire. And to him. Him who? Sorella hesitated. General Krex. He's a warlord who has been challenging my father's rule for years. If he's making another move, it could mean war. Dax leaned back in his chair, his usual grin replaced by a rare look of concern. Well, that complicates things. Sorella sighed, resting her head in her hands. I thought I was starting to find my place here, but now it feels like everything is slipping away again. Dax reached across the table and tapped her staff with his finger. You've got more fight in you than you realize, Glowstick. And no matter what happens, you're not facing it alone. She looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you, Dax. Don't mention it, he said, smirking again. Just promise me one thing. What's that? If we're going to war, I get to name the battle strategies. I've got some great ideas. Operation Goat Wrath has a nice ring to it. Sorella laughed, the sound cutting through the tension like a ray of light. You are impossible. And you're stuck with me, Dax said, raising his mug in a mock toast. As the two of them sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of the galaxy's troubles pressing down on them, they found solace in each other's company and in the absurdity of their situation. The air on the farm had shifted since King Tyvorex's visit, and not just because Dax had finally agreed to clean the barn. Sorella felt it in her bones, a low, thrumming tension that refused to fade. Even Fluffy seemed more irritable than usual, which was saying something. Dax noticed, of course, but in typical Dax fashion, he refused to dwell on it. Instead, he upped the ridiculousness of their training sessions. One morning, she found herself wearing what he called weighted boots of doom, which turned out to be repurposed engine parts strapped to her feet. I don't see how this is supposed to help, Sorella grumbled, stumbling across the training yard like a drunken toddler. Balance and stamina, Dax said cheerfully, lounging in a hammock. Also, it's hilarious to watch. She shot him a glare that could have melted steel. You are insufferable. And yet here you are, he replied, raising his mug in salute. And the day took an unexpected turn when the sky above the farm lit up with a cascade of fiery streaks. Sorella froze, the weighted boots suddenly forgotten. Dax? She said, pointing skyward. He squinted at the approaching ships, his grin fading. Well, that's not great. A fleet of sleek black vessels descended, their hulls glinting ominously in the sunlight. They formed a perimeter around the farm, their engines humming with a sound that made the ground vibrate. At their center was a massive flagship, its design brutal and efficient, like a blade meant to cut through the stars themselves. Sorella's heart sank. She recognized that ship. Krex, she whispered. Dax was on his feet in an instant, his usual levity replaced by sharp focus. Who's Krex? A warlord, Sorella said, gripping her staff tightly. He's the one I told you about, the one challenging my father's rule. Great, Dax muttered, and here I was hoping for a quiet day. The flagship's ramp extended with a hiss of steam, and out stepped General Krex. He was everything Sorella remembered, towering and broad-shouldered, with a face like chiseled stone and eyes that glowed a malevolent red. His armor was dark and imposing, adorned with the insignia of his rogue fleet. "Princess Sorella," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to reverberate through the air. "I have come to offer you a choice." Dax stepped forward, placing himself between Sorella and the warlord. "Yeah, see? We're not big on unsolicited visits around here. You've got about 5 seconds to state your business before I get the goat involved." Crex's gaze flicked to Dax, his expression unreadable. "And you are?" "Her trainer," Dax said, crossing his arms, "and personal goat wrangler. You mess with her, you mess with Fluffy." "Enough," Sorella said, stepping forward. She met Crex's gaze with a courage she hadn't realized she possessed. "What do you want?" "I want what I have always wanted," Crex said. "To see the Nyrixian Empire crumble, but more than that I want to test you, Princess. Word of your transformation has reached even my ears, and I wish to see if you are as formidable as they say." Sorella stiffened. "This is a challenge?" "It is," Crex said, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Defeat me, and I will leave this planet in peace, for now. Lose, and you will join my fleet." Dax pulled Sorella aside, his voice low and urgent. "This guy's got a serious case of megalomania. You can't seriously be thinking about accepting." "I don't have a choice," Sorella said, her grip tightening on her staff. "If I back down, it will only embolden him. My father's empire depends on me standing my ground." Dax sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but if you're doing this, you're doing it smart." He handed her a small circular device. "What is this?" "A shield generator," he said. "It's experimental, so try not to break it. Or yourself." And the training yard became the arena, with Crex's guards and Dax as the unlikely audience. Crex stood in the center, his energy blade humming ominously. Sorella stepped forward, activating the shield generator on her wrist. A shimmering barrier enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt a spark of confidence. The duel began with a clash of energy and light. Crex's attacks were brutal and relentless, his blade a blur of motion. Sorella struggled to keep up, her staff barely holding its own against his sheer strength. "You have improved," Crex said, his tone almost conversational, "but you are still unrefined, undisciplined." "Thanks for the feedback," Sorella shot back, dodging a particularly vicious swing. "I'll be sure to fill out a comment card later." From the sidelines, Dax couldn't resist chiming in. "You tell him, Glowstick, hit him where it hurts, his ego." The tide of the battle shifted when Sorella began to tap into the energy within her. It surged through her like a current, amplifying her speed and precision. She parried Crex's blade with newfound confidence, her movements becoming fluid and deliberate. Crex's expression darkened as he realized he was no longer toying with an untrained princess. "You've been hiding your true strength," he said. "Not hiding," Sorella replied, delivering a powerful strike that sent him staggering. "Learning." With a final, decisive blow, she disarmed him, her staff aimed at his chest. The energy around her flared brightly, casting an ethereal glow over the yard. The guards tensed, but Crex held up a hand to stop them. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but edged with something that might have been respect. "You have proven yourself, Princess." As Crex and his fleet departed, Dax let out a long whistle. "Well, that was something." Sorella collapsed onto the grass, her chest heaving. "I can't believe I did that." "Believe it," Dax said, grinning as he helped her to her feet. "You just sent a warlord packing. Not bad for a day's work." She smiled, exhaustion and relief washing over her. "Thank you, Dax, for everything." "Hey, that's what trainers are for," he said, slinging an arm around her shoulders. "Now, let's celebrate with something classy. I'm thinking microwave pizza." As the sun set over the farm, Sorella couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of hope. She had faced a warlord and won, but more importantly, she had proven to herself that she was capable of so much more than she had ever imagined. The quiet of the farm was deceptive. After the battle with Krex, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Sorella found herself longing for a sense of normalcy, though normal on Dax's farm was a loose term at best. Take breakfast, for example. One morning, Dax attempted to cook what he called intergalactic pancakes, which turned out to be a mix of alien grains, human flour, and something green that might have been algae. The result was an alarming shade of purple and had the consistency of wet cement. "Is it supposed to smell like this?" Sorella asked, poking the dubious pile with her fork. "It's an acquired taste," Dax said, shoveling a bite into his mouth and immediately regretting it. "You mean taste as in toxic fumes, right?" she quipped, sliding her plate toward Fluffy, who sniffed it once and bleated in protest. "Fine," Dax grumbled, dumping the pancakes into the compost bin. "Guess I'll stick to my famous space chili." "Infamous," Sorella corrected, grinning. Their momentary reprieve ended when a distress signal crackled through Dax's old comm unit. The garbled message was barely decipherable, but the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. "This is Outpost Z-47. Under attack. Need immediate assistance. Krex's fleet." Sorella's stomach tightened. Krex had not given up. His retreat from the farm had been temporary, a calculated move to regroup and strike elsewhere. Dax frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Z-47's a mining colony, right? They're not exactly equipped for a full-scale assault." "They won't stand a chance," Sorella said, her voice firm. "We have to help." Dax gave her a long look, then nodded. "All right, Glowstick, gear up. We're taking the Rust Bucket." The Rust Bucket, as Dax affectionately called it, was his personal starship, a patched-together hunk of metal that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrapyard. Despite its appearance, the ship was surprisingly reliable, though it had its quirks. "Why does the navigation console smell like burnt cheese?" Sorella asked as they prepped for launch. "Long story," Dax said, flipping switches. "Let's just say it involves a malfunctioning fusion core and a very unfortunate grilled cheese experiment." The ship roared to life, its engines emitting a sound that could only be described as an angry groan. Sorella strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her staff within arm's reach. "Ready?" Dax asked, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "Let's do this," she said, and the Rust Bucket shot into the sky, leaving the farm behind. Post Z-47 came into view hours later, its once bustling mining platforms now ablaze. Krex's fleet swarmed the colony like a nest of hornets, their sleek fighters strafing the surface with ruthless precision. "Looks like we've got company," Dax said, dodging an incoming blast with a maneuver that made Sorella's stomach lurch. "Do you even know how to fly this thing?" she asked, gripping the armrest. "Define no," Dax replied, grinning as he flipped the ship into a barrel roll. Sorella groaned but focused her attention on the controls. "We need to draw their fire away from the colony. Can this thing handle combat?" "Technically, yes," Dax said, pulling a lever that deployed a pair of outdated laser turrets. "But don't expect miracles." The Rust Bucket weaved through the chaos, its turrets firing sporadically at the enemy fighters. Dax's reckless piloting kept them just ahead of the blasts, though Sorella wasn't sure if he was dodging on purpose or just lucky. "Hang on!" Dax shouted, slamming a button that unleashed a burst of chaff into their pursuer's path. The enemy ships veered off course, giving them a brief respite. Sorella took the opportunity to scan the battlefield. "There's a command ship over there," she said, pointing to a massive cruiser at the edge of the colony. "If we take it out, we might be able to disable the fleet." Dax raised an eyebrow. "You've got a plan, Glowstick?" "Sort of," she admitted. "That's my girl," he said, steering the ship toward the cruiser. Boarding the command ship was easier than expected, likely because no one anticipated a rusty civilian freighter to come crashing through their hangar bay. The rust bucket skidded to a halt amidst a shower of sparks, its hull groaning in protest. "Smooth landing," Sorella deadpanned as they disembarked. "I aim to please," Dax said, drawing his blaster. The interior of the cruiser was a maze of sterile corridors, but Sorella's instincts guided them toward the command center. Along the way, they encountered resistance, Krex's soldiers, heavily armed and clearly unamused by their presence. Dax's blaster fire echoed through the halls as Sorella used her staff to deflect energy bolts with startling precision. Her training on the farm had sharpened her reflexes, and the strange energy within her felt stronger than ever. At one point, Dax ducked behind a crate and muttered, "Why do these guys always have the best gear? It's not fair." "Maybe you should ask them for tips," Sorella said, spinning her staff to knock a weapon out of a soldier's hands. "Not my style," he replied, popping up to take another shot. "I prefer to wing it." They reached the command center just as an alarm blared through the ship. Krex stood at the center of the room, his expression darkening as he saw them. "You again," he growled, his energy blade igniting with a menacing hum. "Miss me?" Sorella said, stepping forward. Dax groaned. "Do you have to antagonize the guy with the giant sword?" Krex didn't wait for a response. He lunged, his blade slashing through the air with deadly precision. Sorella met him head-on, her staff crackling with energy as it clashed against his weapon. The battle was intense, each strike sending shockwaves through the room. Dax, ever the opportunist, used the chaos to disable the ship's systems, his fingers flying over the controls. "Got it!" he shouted as the lights flickered and the alarm cut off. "Engines are down, this ship isn't going anywhere." Krex roared in frustration, his attacks growing more desperate. Sorella seized the opening, delivering a powerful blow that disarmed him and sent him sprawling. "It's over," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "For now," Krex spat, glaring up at her. "But this is far from finished, Princess." As they made their escape, the rust bucket barely holding together, Dax turned to Sorella with a grin. "Not bad for a couple of misfits," he said. Sorella smiled, the weight of the battle lifting ever so slightly. "Thanks, Dax, for always having my back." "Anytime, Glowstick," he said, punching the ship into hyperspace. The stars stretched into streaks of light, and for the first time in days, Sorella allowed herself to breathe. The fight was far from over, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The return to the Nyrixian homeworld was both grand and absurd. The rust bucket limped into the royal docking bay with all the grace of a drunk bantha, its landing gear giving out halfway, causing the ship to tilt awkwardly to one side. "Perfect landing," Dax declared, unstrapping himself from the pilot's seat. "If by perfect you mean catastrophic," Sorella muttered, grabbing her staff as they prepared to disembark. The royal guards were already assembling when the ramp hissed open, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. At their head stood King Tyverex, resplendent in his ceremonial armor. His stern expression faltered as Sorella stepped forward, her presence commanding in a way he had never seen before. "My daughter," he said, his voice betraying both awe and uncertainty. "You have returned." "I have," Sorella said, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. "And I bring news." In the Grand Council chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Sorella recounted the events of her time away, from her training on the farm to her encounter with Krex and the battle at Outpost Z-47. Her words carried weight, and for the first time Tyverex truly listened. "So the warlord lives," the king said, his expression darkening. "Yes," Sorella said, "but he's been weakened. His fleet is scattered, his resources strained. The Empire has a chance to unite and face him, but it requires more than strength. It requires trust and collaboration." Tyverex studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak as if you know what must be done." "Because I do," she said firmly. "I've seen what our people are capable of when given a chance. We don't need to rule through fear, Father. We can inspire loyalty through respect and compassion." Dax, standing off to the side, couldn't resist chiming in. Also, maybe fewer gigantic statues of yourself. Just a thought. Tyverex shot him a glare, but Sorella hid a smile. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Sorella worked tirelessly to rebuild the connections that her father's regime had strained. She visited outposts, spoke to leaders, and rallied troops, not as a princess demanding obedience, but as a warrior who had fought alongside them. Her efforts bore fruit. The Nyrixian forces began to unify, their ranks bolstered by those who had once doubted the Empire's leadership. Even the most cynical officers couldn't deny the impact of her transformation. "Never thought I'd say this," Dax said one evening as they reviewed fleet formations. "But you're actually kind of good at this leadership thing." "Thanks," Sorella said, arching an eyebrow. "Coming from you, that means almost nothing." "Hey," Dax protested, "I'm a very supportive mentor." "You made me wear boots filled with lead," she shot back. "And look how far you've come," he said, grinning. The final confrontation with Krex was inevitable. His remaining fleet gathered near the edge of the Empire, hoping to catch the Nyrixians off guard. Instead, they found a united force waiting for them. The battle was fierce, but Sorella's leadership turned the tide. She led the charge herself, her staff glowing with energy as she fought alongside her people. Krex's flagship was finally disabled, and the warlord surrendered, his arrogance giving way to a grudging respect. "You have proven me wrong," he admitted as he was taken into custody. "The frail princess I once dismissed is no more." Sorella met his gaze without flinching. "You underestimated me. That was your first mistake." With Krex defeated, the galaxy breathed a sigh of relief. The Nyrixian Empire began to rebuild, not as a fearsome dominion, but as a beacon of hope and cooperation. Tyverex, humbled by his daughter's achievements, stepped back from the throne, naming Sorella as his successor. The coronation was a grand affair, though Dax managed to keep things from getting too formal. "Do I have to wear this?" he asked, tugging at the ill-fitting ceremonial robes he'd been given. "Yes," Sorella said, barely suppressing a laugh. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Immensely." In the days that followed, Sorella found herself reflecting on her journey. The farm, the battles, the moments of doubt and triumph. They had all shaped her into someone she barely recognized. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a warrior, a leader, and perhaps most importantly, a friend. Dax, ever the enigma, stayed on as her advisor, though he insisted on keeping his farm as a backup plan. "You never know," he said with a wink. "Galactic politics can be a real headache." Sorella smiled, knowing she wouldn't have made it this far without him. As she stood on the palace balcony, gazing out at the stars, she felt a sense of peace. The galaxy was far from perfect, but for the first time, she believed it could be better. "Glowstick," Dax said, joining her. "You did good." "Thanks, Dax," she said, her voice soft. He grinned. "Now how about we celebrate with some space chili?" Sorella laughed, the sound carrying into the night. For all the battles won and challenges ahead, one thing was certain. This was just the beginning of her story.